situation in Ukraine. Unprovoked escalation of Russian aggression against Ukraine gives reasons to believe that crimes within the jurisdiction of the ICC continue to be committed on the territory of Ukraine. Along with the situation in Crimea and Donbass, recent events suggest that aggressors' troops continue to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. Dear colleagues, one might consider observing the bloodshed in Ukraine that it is not my war. It is a mistake. The evil will never stop. It requires more and more space to conquer. If tolerated, it advances further and further. The draft resolution is one of the building blocks to build a wall to stop it, to stop in Ukraine and not to let it go further. The wall that will protect all of you, in particular younger generations. Distinguished delegates, by voting today, you also reconfirm your country's commitment to the UN Charter. After the vote, I invite you, ambassadors and representatives, to stop by the Indonesian lounge and to sign this little blue book. Little but of global magnitude. Every vote in favor of the resolution and every signature of country that voted in favor would be a historical reconfirmation of the Charter. It is very easy, ladies and gentlemen, to sign the Charter at time of peace. It is the duty to sign and reconfirm and implement the Charter at the time of war. So stop by the Indonesian lounge, put the name of your country if you voted in favor, and after you sign this book, I will hand it over to the Secretary General for keeping the book in his office, in front of him. So at every single moment, the Secretary General will get an inspiration from the overwhelming majority of nations who still trust in the UN, who still trust in the UN Charter. There is a very fragile gentleman, a very old one. He was born in a territory that was part of the Kingdom of Hungary. He will celebrate his 102 years birthday in 9 days. His name is Benjamin Ferenc. Benjamin Ferenc was an investigator of war crimes, a chief prosecutor at one of the 12 subsequent trials of Nuremberg. Later, he became an advocate of international rule of law and for the establishment of the International Criminal Court. With the permission of the producer, I would play a couple of seconds of his words. And I want you to listen very carefully.
It's hard to do. 3 words: law, not war. If you can do that, you save every day billions of dollars, which you can use to deal with the legitimate complaints of old people who need medical care, students who have to pay for their tuition, all the legitimate complaints which could be solved if we didn't spend the money on weapons to kill them. instead of helping them. And that is the current system. Now, how are you going to do it? I will end by telling you how to do it. And the principles which have guided me. There are three principles. One, never give up. Two, never give up. Three, I hear you, never give up. Good luck. I wish you the best of luck.
Please show respect. Show respect to the Charter. Show respect to the Secretary General. Show respect to this gentleman who will celebrate 102 years since his birthday. I call upon all responsible member states to support the draft. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine. We shall now proceed to consider draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. Before I open the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Russian Federation.
President, Secretary General, colleagues, Russia would ask for this draft resolution to be put to the vote. And we call on you not to support this draft. However, we know about the unprecedented pressure that our Western partners are exerting on a large number of countries, urging them to vote as they see fit. This is not something even that we can call pressure. It was open and cynical threats, and we know about it. This document will not allow us to end military activities. On the contrary, it could embolden Kiev radicals and nationalists to continue to determine the policy of their country at any price, holding peaceful civilians hostage, but not in the figurative sense of the term, but in the literal sense of it. Now, that is what is happening in a series of cities in Ukraine where people are being used as human shields. Today, we've learned that in the Ukrainian military are not allowing citizens of Mariupol to leave the city. They are keeping them there, including women and children there in one of the schools in Mariupol, and forcing them, turning back all civilians who are trying to leave the city along humanitarian corridors. We also know about planned nationalist battalions who are planning provocations, which they have been preparing with the participation of civilians, so that then they can accuse Russia of having carried them out. Running against norms of international humanitarian law, and military hardware is being placed in residential areas, as well as rocket launchers and artillery. Today, we will provide examples of this to the UN leadership, who are still asserting that they don't have this kind of evidence, although videos taken by Ukrainian citizens are freely available on the internet. Responsibility for this fully lies with the Ukrainian authorities, much like for the irresponsible and criminal distribution of weapons to anyone who wants one, including those who have been released from prison. This has already led to many cases of robbery, murder, and plundering. Colleagues, your refusal to support today's draft resolution as a vote for a peaceful Ukraine free from radicalism and neo-Nazism, living in peace with its neighbours, and refusing to be managed from outside. This was the aim of our special military operation, who the sponsors of this resolution tried to present as aggression. We heard from the Ukrainian representative words about Nazism, but he didn't mention the rampant neo-Nazism in Ukraine itself and the rampant neo-Nazis and neo-nationalist radical organizations, about torch-lit processions and those who support Hitler. Those who are interested in the development of the Ukrainian crisis and how it has developed very much understand where it came from. In actions today, we're trying to stop the 8-year war of the Maidan regime on the people of Donbass. Over the last years, our country has done everything it can, and things are impossible to avoid this kind of scenario. We, according to the Secretary General, have left no stone unturned and knocked on every door. However, we were not listened to. Those living in Donbass are still being bombed. They don't plan on stopping at 14,000 victims, the vast majority of which are living in the LPR and DPR, were living in the LPR and DPR. The aim of our special operation is announced on the basis of Article 51 of the UN Charter and will be achieved. However, we are not carrying out strikes on civilian facilities and civilians. Don't believe the large number of fakes spread around the internet on this. These fakes have only distributed like biscuits at operation centres, special operations of Ukraine, and this centre was destroyed. A peaceful scenario for Ukraine could happen if the radicals concern about preserving civilian lives in their country and rather than hiding behind them. This is a call in the text before the vote. There is no reference to this call in the text before us to vote on. Nothing is mentioned about the illegal coup in Kiev in February 2014, with the connivance of Germany, France and Poland, and with the support of the United States, where the legitimately elected president of the country was overthrown. This draft does not mention anything along the lines that the new nationalist authorities are limiting the rights of citizens to use the Russian language. This was a green light for a large chain of events of violations of the basic rights of those living in the east of the country, not only in the east of the country, including the most valuable right, that right to life. Many of you don't want to hear about this, about the tragedies happening in Ukraine after the Maidan coup in 2014. And those people who burnt alive in Odessa, and the crimes of those who didn't agree, against those who didn't agree with them. And the most blatant example of this was the war against Donbass rolled out by Kiev. There's nothing in the document either that over the last 8 years, Europe and the US have been pumping the Ukraine with weapons so that those people can kill civilians in the Donbass. And the loyal authorities in Kiev are fully ignoring the Minsk agreements and sabotaging Security Council Resolution 2202. Finally, this draft is a clear attempt of those who, over the last decades, have committed huge numbers of aggressions, illegal and international law, as well as coups, one of which indeed was the Maidan coup in Ukraine. They present themselves as champions of international law. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Serbia.
Most sincerely regrets events taking place in the east of Europe. Russia and Ukraine have always been friendly country to the Republic of Serbia, and Serbian people perceives Russians and Ukrainians as fraternal nations. We felt loss of life of each man in Ukraine is true tragedy. The Republic of Serbia is committed to observing principles of territorial integrity and political independence of states as one of the basic principles of international law based on UN Charter and final act from Helsinki from 1975, which guarantees the right of states to inviolability of borders, just like it is committed to preservation of sovereignty and integrity of its own territory. The Republic of Serbia, likewise, advocating respect for territorial integrity of other sovereign nations, and regardless of not agreeing with all formulation state in resolution, will vote in favor of resolution. I am obliged to point to PP 13 and remind that the first attack against a sovereign state on the soil of Europe after the Second World War took place not so long ago, in 1999, when 19 countries attacked, at that time, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, primarily Republic of Serbia, when there was no appropriate reaction of such distinguished institution to this flagrant violation of UN Charter, despite the fact they still suffer from consequence of severe violation of fundamental principles of international law by others. Serbia is not giving up these principles even today. The Republic of Serbia will continue to advocate termination of conflicts, expecting that the parties will invest additional efforts into reaching diplomatic solution and creating conditions for peace throughout dialogue. Serbia will provide all kind humanitarian aid to endangered Ukrainian citizens while remaining committed to peace and consistent respect for international law. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Serbia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
Shukran, Sayyid Rais.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the draft resolution before us today clearly represents a prejudiced attitude based on political propaganda. It's a means of political pressure. Those who prepared the draft resolution incorporated an aggressive language against the Russian Federation to belittle its legitimate stand based on its security concerns and its right to protect its people from the threats to national Russian security. Belarus is also impacted by this draft resolution. This draft resolution represents a flagrant political hypocrisy. Had the US and its Western allies been serious in de-escalating the situation, they would have fulfilled the promises they undertook 3 decades ago not to expand EU and transform Ukraine into a continuous threat to the Russian Federation. And they should have pressured Ukraine to abide by Minsk and to stop the violations against the civilians in Donbass, let alone those countries' eagerness to supply Ukraine with heavy weaponry and missiles, encouraging volunteers to fight in Ukraine. This indicates the clear-cut desire of those countries for provocations and not for containment and de-escalation. This draft resolution coincides with huge media campaign to spread erroneous information and lies. It's not designed to find a clear-cut and real solution for the crisis, rather to defame the Russian Federation. It is a text that is full of loopholes and untruths. It ignores the real reasons for the escalation of tension and for the eruption of hostilities. Those who are eager to defend the Charter of the United Nations now today, they should have shown the same eagerness vis-à-vis Israel's continued occupation of the Arab territories and the aggression committed by the Turkish forces against our territory. What about the U.S. violations of the territorial integrity of our land, Syrian territories? Syria's rejection of Western hegemonistic policies and interference in the internal affairs of states, prolongating crises, promulgating and spreading anarchy, opting for double standards and selectivities, imposing unilateral sanctions, make it necessary for us to reject this draft resolution and vote against it. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Mr. President, it is clear from the debate over the past 2 days that the membership of the United Nations is united in its call to end the war in Ukraine and return to diplomacy. St. Vincent and the Grenadines wishes to offer an explanation of its vote on the draft resolution before us today. Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines will vote in favor of the draft resolution. We will vote in accordance with our steadfast commitment to upholding the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, which form the core of multilateralism and gave birth to our United Nations 76 years ago. It bears repeating, Mr. President, that these principles underscore respect for sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of states and enjoin member states to refrain from the threat or the use of force in the conduct of their international relations. Our support for the draft resolution is rooted in our conviction that the strict adherence to international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law, and the principles of peace, dialogue, and compromise for the preservation of humanity is not optional. As a small island developing state, full compliance with the bedrock principles of international law remains an existential issue. We take the floor again, Mr. President, to repeat our call for these principles to be applied consistently and upheld as universal truths instead of selective, uneven, and unpredictable tools to further great power ambition anywhere and by anyone. Historically, and in recent times, we have witnessed the naked hypocrisy, double standards, and cynical misapplication of international law, which we have condemned. Today, we strongly emphasize that our august assembly should apply the fundamental principles of our charter impartially, irrespective of the size, economic, and military power of the principles involved. Mr. President, in the midst of prevailing global challenges, such as the climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, we simply cannot afford another conflict. War does not manage grievances. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, therefore, calls for an immediate ceasefire to avert further bloodshed, human suffering, and a global catastrophe, and to engage in peaceful dialogue to find a solution to this war post-haste. Today, we must unite for peace. Thank you, and peace profound to all.
I thank the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We have heard the last speaker in explanations of vote before the vote. Before proceeding to take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1, I wish to address the question concerning the majority required for the adoption of the draft resolution. In light of Article 18, paragraph 2 and 3 of the Charter of the United Nations, is there any objection to taking action on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 by a two-thirds majority of the members present and voting? I see no objection. The two-thirds majority of members present and voting is therefore required for the adoption of draft resolution A/ES-11/L1. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Mr. President, I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to delegations listed on the L document, the following countries have also become the co-sponsors of A/ES-11/L11, Barbados and Cambodia. If any other country wish to co-sponsor A/ES-11/L1, please signify by pressing the microphone button now. There is nothing further, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES-11/L1, please signify. Those against, abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. The result of The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 141, against 5, abstentions 35. Draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Tunisia voted in favor of the draft resolution in support of the principles and values of the UN Charter on which our foreign policy is based. We would like to emphasize that the crisis must be settled by peaceful means, which is the ideal solution to prevent further aggravation of the situation and further human tragedy. The world witnessed so many grueling wars destructive to peace and security and the life of people. Our experience indicates that military options cannot solve any crisis. Dialogue and negotiations can settle all differences and finding compromises. The current crisis in Ukraine comes at a time the world was getting out of COVID-19 and prepare itself for a new stage based on solidarity, cooperation, and effective engagement in multilateral action and achieving our common agenda. We believe that the world cannot undertake or cannot burden itself by further crises. We encouraged the engagement of the parties in peaceful negotiations, and we urged the international community to intensify efforts to obligate these parties to resort to negotiations in a manner to cease hostilities and to prepare the way for finding permanent solution. Given the fact that international peace and security are a whole, Tunisia calls for dealing with all just questions in one standard so that peoples can regain their legitimate rights in accordance with international legitimacy to build a more stable, more peaceful world. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Rwanda.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Mr. President, Rwanda takes the floor to explain its position on the vote we just cast. Rwanda voted in favor of this resolution to firmly support that sovereignty, independence, and interior integrity of any country must be respected. We supported this resolution to reaffirm our commitment to the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, military escalation should cease immediately and go for peaceful settlement of the crisis. The Russian Federation and Ukraine have the key to resolve this conflict. The external intervention will only worsen the situation. Mr. President, we fully support international efforts to de-escalate the war, including the efforts of the Secretary General in solving the crisis. We urge all concerned parties to demonstrate calm and seek a solution to the conflict through dialogue to ensure that civilians do not continue to pay the heaviest price. A lasting solution, Mr. President, will only be achieved through dialogue by both parties, taking into account the concerns of both sides. The current war does not guarantee that it will bring peace. Instead, it's likely to generate subsequent crises and human suffering. Rwanda also expresses serious concern with
the General Assembly has spoken. As Secretary General, it is my duty to stand by this resolution and be guided by its call. The message of the General Assembly is loud and clear. End hostilities in Ukraine now, silence the guns now, open the door to dialogue and diplomacy now. The territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine must be respected in line with the UN Charter. We don't have a moment to lose. The brutal effects of the conflict are plain to see. But as bad as the situation is for the people in Ukraine right now, it threatens to get much, much worse. The ticking clock is a time bomb. I'm also deeply concerned with its potential consequences for regional and global peace and security, and the world struggling to recover from COVID. Today's resolution reflects a central truth. The world wants an end to the tremendous human suffering in Ukraine. The same truth was clear in the rapid mobilization of funds for our life-saving humanitarian operations in Ukraine and neighboring countries. Our global flash appeal was met with record generosity. I'm deeply grateful to donors for their support. With that funding in hand, we will be able to scale up to deliver of vital medical and health supplies, food, safe drinking water, shelter, and protection. Looking ahead, I will continue to do everything in my power to contribute to an immediate cessation of hostilities and urgent negotiations for peace. People in Ukraine desperately need peace, and people around the world demand it. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Today, the world has spoken with a clear, united voice. Together, the vast majority of the world has condemned Russia's unprovoked, unjustified, unconscionable war. We have deplored Belarus for allowing its territory to be used to facilitate this aggression. We have affirmed Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We have demonstrated that Russia is isolated and alone. And that's the cost, that the costs will keep rising until Russia relents. We have affirmed the UN Charter, pledged to address the horrific human rights and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, and stood together in the battle for the soul of the world. Last night, at his State of the Union address, President Biden commended the courage of the Ukrainian people. He declared that the United States of America stands with Ukraine, and quoted President Zelensky when he said, "Light will win over darkness." Today at the United Nations, light has won over darkness. 141 states voted to support this amendment. The world, as President Biden said, is choosing the side of peace and security. Now, as the situation grows graver, every day in Ukraine, we must keep the momentum going. We must do everything we can to help the Ukrainian people, to hold Russia accountable, to match our strong words with strong actions. Let us continue to come together to support the Ukrainian people, and let us demonstrate the true power and true purpose of the United Nations for all. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, how satisfied are you with the fact that 141 countries supported the resolution? Did you expect that?
We worked for that.
Is the number the right one? What about the humanitarian resolution? Sorry.
That's still up for
When do you
discussion.
think you are going to vote
I
about
can't
it?
But
give you
it's more,
anything.
it's above your the numbers of abstention, the numbers.
We would have hoped that the 35 people who abstained would have voted yes with us as well. So it was not at our expectation. We would have hoped for more. Thank you.
Hey, good, is it morning or afternoon? I'm not sure. Look, I just want to say from the part of the European Union that last week we had the Security Council trying its best but blocked by one country, Russia, for taking its responsibility. Immediately after that happened, we got to work drafting this resolution together with Ukraine and very many other countries of the world, and today the General Assembly has taken its responsibility. The message in this resolution is very, very clear, and the voting pattern is very, very clear. Russia stands isolated. Russia has been asked by the world to pull back, stop the aggression, and seek diplomacy instead of war. We have heard so many passionate statements over the last few days manifesting what I just said, that the world has stated clearly, stop the aggression, withdraw troops, and abide by the rules of the UN Charter and protect this organization. So I just want to say too that the European Union and the world stands with Ukraine. I thank you very much.
Do you have a message for the countries who abstain from this resolution?
Not today. Thank you.
of affected civilians and the humanitarian consequences of the hostilities and violence in the area. In this regard, we call on all parties to fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law. We are also concerned with the potential longer-term consequences on the rules-based international order and renew our call towards peace and for all parties to enhance dialogue through various means to truly realize a peaceful settlement of the situation. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Mr. President, we recognize the exceptional circumstances we are all facing, and we share the conviction that the General Assembly could not remain silent. The resolution adopted this morning conveys a message, and Brazil has added its voice to that of other members. The adoption of this resolution by the General Assembly shows the unwavering commitment of the international community to upholding the core principles upon which the UN is built. We are appreciative of the attention given in different paragraphs of the text to the critical need to monitor and alleviate the humanitarian situation on the ground. We also welcome the text for urging the parties to the conflict to fully respect international humanitarian law, to guarantee the safety of civilians, as well as of humanitarian and medical personnel, and to facilitate unhindered access of humanitarian assistance to those in need. The resolution as adopted, however, does not go far enough in underscoring that the cessation of hostilities is only a first step to achieve peace. Sustainable peace needs additional steps. In this respect, it is regrettable that the supportive role of the United Nations, that the United Nations can and should play, has been left by the wayside in the eagerness to point fingers. Yes, the resolution is a call for peace by the international community, but peace requires more than the silence of guns and the withdrawal of troops. The path to peace requires comprehensive work on the security concerns of the parties. The only precondition should be an immediate ceasefire. Mr. President, the resolution cannot be seen as permissive towards the indiscriminate application of sanctions and the deployment of arms. These initiatives are not conducive to the proper resumption of a constructive diplomatic dialogue and risk further escalating tensions with unpredictable consequences to the region and beyond. We also have concerns about preambular paragraph 15. It is not constructive at this moment fraught with danger in this particular resolution to comment on military measures adopted by any specific nuclear power, be it the Russian Federation or the members of NATO. Once effective negotiations do get started, all the parties must show true flexibility and spirit of compromise. Lasting solutions can only be achieved at the negotiating table through committed dialogue. Brazil continues to urge all actors to de-escalate and to renew efforts in favor of a negotiated diplomatic agreement between Ukraine and Russia that contributes to the establishment of the security and the stability of the region. We stand ready to resolutely work in favor of peace in the discussions in this Assembly, in the Security Council, and in other fora. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. This emergency special session comes as the conflict in Ukraine has reached a dangerous inflection point. The international community is alarmed by developments on the ground, and this is the clear message of today's resounding vote. The humanitarian situation is worsening by the day. We have seen reports of rapidly growing civilian casualties and massive displacement, the extent of which Europe has not experienced in decades. the UAE is deeply concerned by these developments. Our collective responsibility must, however, be towards exhausting all efforts and using all diplomatic channels to prevent a further deterioration of the humanitarian situation. We remain firm in that belief more than ever before. Yesterday, the UAE pledged $5 million in response to the UN's humanitarian flash appeal. We know that in the days, weeks, and months ahead, more must be done. The credibility of this organization, born out of the ashes of World War II, rests on its universal representation and its effectiveness in applying the principles that we all uphold. However, as this conflict has revealed, the clear and full voice of the United Nations has only grown harder to summon because it is not equally applied. Despite deepening divisions, now is time to take a step back, identify diplomatic off-ramps, and engage constructively to end this conflict. It is also a time to summon our reserves of wisdom and experience to guide the way forward. Global solidarity means doing more than focusing on conflicts in some parts of the world while ignoring others. We need to shift our mindset from conflict management to conflict resolution. Our collective security depends on it. Let this crisis be the wake-up call. The future of this organization may rest on that. We all need to galvanize UN efforts to promote the dialogue, work towards an end to the hostilities, and address the humanitarian situation for those most desperately in need. The UAE recognizes the need to meet this moment with renewed diplomacy and leadership, and put the needs of the people on the ground at the center of our efforts. The avenues for dialogue must, however, remain open more urgently than ever before, and we must pursue them together. Mr. President, right now we recognize that this resolution adopted here today is a necessary signal of where we need to be going. Resigning ourselves to a cycle of perpetual violence and sanctions that only adds to the suffering of civilians diminishes us all. We voted for this resolution, and we join with member states in making this appeal to peace, a just peace that endures by recognizing the legitimate concerns of all parties and also abides by the UN's charters of principles and independence and sovereignty and territorial integrity. This resolution, however, as others have said, is not enough for a sustainable peace. Resolution of this conflict requires dialogue and effective diplomacy. This text represents the determination of member states to respond to the conflict today in Ukraine. That is the call that rings clearly from this meeting. We must now turn to finding ways to bring about its peaceful resolution with full respect for and commitment to real and engaged diplomacy. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. India has been deeply concerned over the rapidly deteriorating situation in Ukraine and the ensuing humanitarian crisis. An Indian national was tragically killed in Kharkiv yesterday due to the ongoing hostilities. We express our deepest condolences to his family and to that of each and every innocent civilian who has lost his or her life in this conflict. We demand safe and uninterrupted passage for all Indian nationals, including our students who are still stranded in Ukraine, particularly from Kharkiv and other cities in the conflict zones. Many member states share this concern. We have reiterated this demand to both the Russian Federation and Ukraine. This remains our foremost priority. Ensuring the well-being and safety of our citizens is the basic duty of every government. We have therefore instituted special flights to bring back Indians home from conflict zones. My government has deployed senior ministers as special envoys to countries neighboring Ukraine to facilitate evacuation. We thank all neighboring countries of Ukraine for opening their borders and extending all facilities to our embassies at this time. India has already dispatched humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. This includes medicines, medical equipment, and other relief material. We are sending more such tranches in the coming days. India supports the international community's call for an immediate ceasefire. We also support safe humanitarian access to conflict zones. We remain firm in our conviction that differences can only be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi has unequivocally conveyed this in his discussions with world leaders, including of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. He underscored the urgent imperative for humanitarian access and movement of stranded civilians. We therefore sincerely hope that the second round of talks between the Russian Federation and Ukraine will lead to a positive outcome. India urges that all member states demonstrate their commitment to the principles of the UN Charter, to international law, and respect of sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. Keeping in view the totality of the evolving situation, India decided to abstain. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bahrain.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. لقد صوتت بلا.
Thank you, President. We voted in favour of the draft resolution A/ES/11/L1 based on our strong conviction of the importance of the principles of the UN Charter, particularly the principles of good neighbourliness and peaceful resolution of conflicts, but also the principle of respect for the independence and territorial integrity of all countries. The Kingdom of Bahrain underscores its support for all efforts that seek to end hostilities and for dialogue to resume and use all diplomatic means necessary to achieve peace. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Bahrain, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Eritrea is taking the floor in explanation of vote after the vote on the draft resolution A/ES-11/L1. Eritrea firmly believes that respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence, as enshrined in the United Nations Charter, are sacrosanct principles and should be respected by everyone at all times for the attainment of sustainable world peace. Eritrea's vote is demonstration of its uncompromising stand for peace. Its position is against internationalizing, incessant rhetoric, and imposition of unilateral sanctions, which regrettably further polarize international relations and escalate the situation with enormous implications for civilians. Instead, we have consistently opted for world regions to be given the needed space and solidarity to address political problems. The situation between Russia and Ukraine raises serious concern with political, economic, and security ramifications for Europe and the rest of the world. It requires immediate resolution by giving more chance to diplomacy. We hope that the ongoing talks between the two parties on the Belarusian border yields a quick and acceptable agreement to stop the war and pave a foundation for peace in the region. Eritrea opposes all forms of unilateral sanctions as illegal and counterproductive. Eritrea, the country that has been subjected to such measures by the West for 2 decades, including new sets of unilateral measures, understands that sanctions do not resolve problems of peace and security. On the contrary, they only hurt innocent people and undermine the road to peace. It will be remiss if I don't address disturbing reports that African citizens living in Ukraine are facing difficulties to cross the borders. We call on all countries to facilitate safe passage to people fleeing for safety regardless of their racial identity.
During the membership of Ukraine and Sweden. It's a defining day, as I said in my statement. I'm happy to report, or rather to confirm what you saw with your own eyes. The United Nations is still alive and going through the process of catharsis. I believe in the United Nations. Now people of Ukraine have more reasons to believe in the United Nations. It is just a beginning. Don't think that it was the end in itself or a purpose in itself, the vote. The vote is a powerful message to the Russian Federation. But I need to refer you to what I said in my statement as well. I still believe that there are citizens of the Russian Federation of dignity who unfortunately right now are cut from the information about how many Russian soldiers are killed in Ukraine. And as soon as they learn the magnitude of the tragedy, I hope they will stop the dictatorship in their country and the war is going to be over. As you know, due to the actions of the Russian Federation in the Security Council last month was not able to perform its duties, and we had to move, as asked by the Security Council, in fact, to the General Assembly. Nevertheless, the Security Council remains busy with Ukrainian issues, with the Russian crisis, and I call on you to call it Russian crisis. Stop calling it Ukrainian crisis. The only country that launched this crisis was Russian Federation. So the Security Council remains busy with issues, how to address like humanitarian problems. I express my sincere gratitude to all nations who have already came forward, offered assistance in money, goods, shelter. I need to ask you to deliver my gratitude to the local authorities of every single country where the refugees are coming and finding their shelter. And those are not only the Ukrainians. I read every day the charts with the nationalities of people who fled to Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Moldova, Romania. It's like the United Nations there. I already read posts from some Africans who say they dream about coming back to beautiful Ukraine. We will rebuild Ukraine. And I tell my staff, I tell my family, the images of buildings destroyed, they are horrifying. But it does not matter at the moment. It's lives of people that matter at the moment. We will rebuild the buildings. We will rebuild every single building, or we will build something better with the help of the international community. So don't be misled by all these malarkeys of Nebenza and his cronies. And I think that the picture of the results speaks for itself. Thank you.
Can I just say one word before you go and put questions to Sergei? Sergei, my good friend, referred to the fact that Sweden, in my previous capacity, worked with Ukraine together on the Security Council. It's true that our colors of the Swedish flag happen to be blue and yellow, as are the colors of the European Union. But today, above all, those are the colors of Ukraine that we all need to carry and carry them high. I want to re-emphasize what I said before. Russia is isolated. Russian aggression will not stand. Today, the world has spoken up against it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olaf.
Mr. Ambassador, what would you like to say to the countries that voted no?
I would like to say once again that in spite of the horrific actions by the criminal regime of Putin, we still believe that there are citizens of Russia who maintain their dignity. So when you tell me that Russia voted against, it's Putin's regime, criminals from Russia who voted against. It is regime of Belarus who voted against, because there are wonderful Belarusian people who also fight for their freedom. So make distinctions in your reporting between the criminals and between the dignity of the people oppressed in those countries.
Thank you. President Zelensky last night asked U.S. President Joe Biden to deliver a useful address regarding Ukraine. I wanted to know your thoughts about the President Biden's State of the Union regarding Ukraine. Were you satisfied?
You know, I lived in Washington and I worked in Washington for many years. I saw many presidents speaking, the American presidents, foreign presidents addressing the U.S. Congress in full session. I saw my colleague, ambassador of Ukraine, on a balcony. She was almost crying. I was watching the address by Biden in the comfort of my office, and I was almost crying. But those are not the emotions that matter. That's the resolution, the resolute posture of the American people. Not just by the politicians in the Senate, by the American people that matters. The spirit of freedom and liberty is genetically in the blood of Ukrainians and Americans, of the British, of the Poles, of all freedom-loving nations on this planet. So the speech was very well received, and I'm sure that the nature of this country is that every single word of President Biden will be followed by specific actions of his government and by specific actions of the members of the U.S. Congress.
Mr. Ambassador, just about that, what action you and your government wants that the United States and the European Union...
I'm not speaking, thank you, I understood, well understood. As I said, there is a very good friend of mine, Ambassador Oksana Markarova, who is in charge of bilateral relationship, and she is 24/7 working with the U.S. government. Please address questions on the cooperation with the United States beyond the United Nations to her. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, tell me.
Ambassador, you got this overwhelming vote and majority to support your resolution. What's next in terms of the United Nations? What steps are you taking?
We are working 24/7. We are working at all levels. I have meetings with the leadership of the Secretariat. I had a meeting yesterday. We suggested certain things. We expecting certain things. I want to, before I go, I need to tell you something. My mission is overwhelmed with the support of my colleagues from all over the world. You know, I receive deputations, delegations of ambassadors and their colleagues with coffee in the morning, with some snacks in the afternoon. I receive so many calls from lawyers, from politicians, from PR companies, from lobbyists, and I say no, thank you very much. We Ukrainians are fit to do our job on our own, and we are doing our job. We will ask you when we need your help with research, with speech writing, with preparing papers. We are working with the teams of international lawyers are working in The Hague for years now on the cases opened in The Hague. But I want to take this moment to express my gratitude to every citizen of this city, to every citizen of New York, to every foreigner working for any mission of in the United Nations. We are overwhelmed with your support. Go to the mission of Singapore at night and see the Ukrainian colors. Teeny nations, small nations, brave as a tiger when it comes to the principles. And the result, as I said already, speaks for itself. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
the floor to elaborate on South Africa's decision to abstain on today's resolution. Mr. President, let me reiterate our position expressed during the discussions of the emergency special session over the last few days. Firstly, by highlighting that South Africa remains deeply concerned by the escalation of conflict in Ukraine and the regional and international socio-economic implications. We strongly urge all sides to uphold international law, including humanitarian law and human rights law, as well as the principles of the UN Charter, including sovereignty and territorial integrity. Mr. President, the conflict involves two members of the United Nations in an armed conflict, which this organization has at its foundation the responsibility to prevent. The United Nations, therefore, must take decisions and actions that will lead to a constructive outcome conducive to the creation of sustainable peace between the parties. The resolution that we have considered today does not create an environment conducive for diplomacy, dialogue, and mediation. While we agree with and support the efforts taken by member states to bring to the attention of the international community the situation in Ukraine, South Africa feels that greater attention should have been paid to bringing the sides closer to dialogue. For South Africa, the text in its current form could drive a deeper wedge between the parties rather than contributing to a resolution of conflict. The resolution should have welcomed the commencement of negotiations between the parties. Additionally, the role of the Security Council, as well as the good offices of the UN Secretary General, could have been given more prominence in the resolution. It is understood that one of the root causes of conflict is related to the security concerns of the parties. This should have been addressed in the resolution. Even though this emergency special session of the General Assembly is being held after the failure of the Security Council to address the matter, we believe that the Security Council should still be urged to play its role as mandated by the Charter to maintain international peace and security. South Africa believes that the UN, especially in the context of emergency special sessions, whose nature and significance speak to the gravity of the issues we bring before the international community, should be used as a platform to build bridges, address the divergence of views, provide recommendation and support for the parties to engage with a spirit of compromise, while de-escalating tensions, committing to the cessation of hostilities, and building trust and confidence. Unfortunately, the text before us did not do that. South Africa will have also preferred an open and transparent process to negotiate the resolution today. This would have allowed all of us, as equal members of the Assembly, to present our views and ideally reach a level of understanding before the text was tabled. As member states of the organization committed to global peace and development, we must continue to work together to promote peace. Gestures that merely create the impression of promoting peace without meaningful action will not assist. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of South Africa, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Lebanon voted yes on this resolution because Lebanon, a founding member of the United Nations, believes in the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, especially the prohibition of the threat or use of force in international relations, the principle of non-intervention, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. Mr. President, these are not merely slogans for Lebanon. We lived through invasions, occupation, intervention in Lebanon's internal affairs, and experienced devastation, loss, and pain that we are still enduring its consequences today. That's why our decision today was not taken lightly. We know what happens in wars, but we also know that wars happen not only when people fail to prevent them, but most importantly, when the voices of war drown the cries for peace. Lebanon, a peace-loving nation, enjoys a good relationship and friendships with all parties to this conflict, with Russia and Ukraine. And in this spirit, we call on everybody to go back to the logic of peace. Mr. President, yesterday, a European colleague told me he has never lived through war. I was happy for him. I lived through at least 2 invasions, a civil war, multiple assassinations, and explosions. That's why, Mr. President, I don't want anybody to live in what we lived through. It's time for diplomacy, for dialogue, and a peaceful resolution of this conflict. I hope that all my colleagues here in this GA hall will put the same energy and commitment that was put to make this vote and its result a reality, to start working for a peaceful resolution that takes both sides' concerns and interests into consideration, so the world will step away from this abyss of war. Mr. President, the preamble of the United Nations Charter tells us, quote, to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security. Now we need this unity. Unity for peace. The United Nations is well positioned to step up and step in to make this peace a reality. Now we need to stop the escalation in words and deeds and help both sides to take the path of peace for the sake, not only the 2 sides, but for the sake of our world. Mr. President, we in the Middle East are very concerned about this war because of its impact on Europe, but also because we know from experience what happens in Europe does not stay in Europe. That the last 2 world wars left deep scars in our part of the world, obliterated countries and hopes, and we are still living its aftermath today. I hope, Mr. President, we all learn the lessons of the last wars, and I hope that from this moment we start working only for peace. Peace in our time, peace in all time, as a former president of the United States said. Mr. President, I agree with Albert Camus in his speech upon receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in Literature in 1957, that probably, and this is a quote, every generation sees itself as charged with remaking the world. Mine, however, knows that it will not remake the world, but its task is perhaps even greater, for it consists in keeping the world from destroying itself. This is the same responsibility bestowed on us as the Charter instructed us to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lebanon, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, as a member of the family of nations, Malaysia is committed to the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations and the ideals it espouses. We reiterate the inviolability of the fundamental principles of territorial integrity and sovereignty of a country, and peaceful settlement of disputes in the maintenance of international peace and security, as well as global prosperity. All parties must uphold these fundamental and sacrosanct principles of the UN Charter and international law that guide the conduct of friendly relations between nations and peaceful coexistence. Many will agree that the resolution before us is far from perfect. While my delegation continues to have concerns with some of the language contained in the resolution, Malaysia voted in favor of it as a matter of principle and out of our strong conviction of the aforementioned principles. Mr. President, Malaysia values its strong and close relation with Ukraine and Russia. We believe the differences and legitimate security concerns of both parties, given the complex geopolitical context, must be addressed through dialogue and peaceful means in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter and rule of law. In this context, we welcome the direct talks held between Russia and Ukraine in Belarus and urge both sides to continue on the peaceful path to prevent further loss of life and destruction. From the vivid discussion at this emergency special session, worryingly to us was an overwhelming desire for the current conflict to be peacefully resolved. The General Assembly has spoken with a clear and fervent voice on the matter today. Now, more than ever, the Security Council has to live up to its primary responsibility as the custodian of international peace and security. Malaysia calls on the Security Council to spare no effort in resolving this conflict. Mr. President, the future of humanity is at a precipice. Humanity must prevail, and peace is the only answer. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nepal.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, my delegation is distressed by the ongoing violence and conflict in Ukraine. Conflict anywhere inflicts stress everywhere. Nepal is a peace-loving country, as its soil is consecrated by the birth of Lord Buddha, an apostle of peace. For us, values of peace, harmony, and peaceful coexistence are our way of life, so they are supremely precious. Norms of world peace, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-aggression as enshrined in the UN Charter are the fundamentals of our foreign policy. The use of force against Ukraine goes contrary to these values and principles. Nepal opposes this violation of international law and the principles of UN Charter. Mr. President, there is no alternative to diplomacy and dialogue, to building peace and sustaining it. Nepal welcomes the second round of talk between Russia and Ukraine. We urge both sides to continue the dialogue with utmost sincerity and integrity to resolve this conflict peacefully and find a lasting political solution for their enduring peace and peace for the Europe. Based on Nepal's principled position on the inviolability of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of any state under international law, rules-based international order, and United Nations Charter, my delegation has voted yes on the draft resolution that was before us today. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nepal, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have requested the floor to justify our vote. Iraq abstained in this vote on resolution A/ES-11/L1. Iraq regrets the deterioration of the situation and the escalating tensions between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And Iraq calls upon all parties to settle this conflict by giving priority to dialogue and through the diplomatic means. And we invite them to go back to negotiations in order to solve their concerns and in order to safeguard international peace and security, and not to threaten the world with economic and political crises resulting from this situation. Iraq expresses its grave concern over the possibility for the terrorists of exploiting this crisis and the expected division in the international community. This would hinder the international efforts and our joint endeavors aiming at preventing terrorism and violent extremism. Iraq has decided to abstain because of our historical background in Iraq and because of our sufferings resulting from the continuing wars against our peoples. Iraq, and in principle, does not support wars as a settlement mechanism. And we reiterate that all conflicts should be settled peacefully in order to safeguard the lives of civilians. Iraq calls upon all parties to uphold the UN Charter and international law, and emphasizes the necessity of safeguarding the security and safety of the international staff and the humanitarian workers. And thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Iraq, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan.
شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Jordan has voted for the draft resolution that has been adopted in order to emphasize the sovereignty of states and their territorial integrity and political independence. And because we believe that force should not be used in international relations because it goes against the provisions of international law and the UN Charter. Jordan hopes that we will be de-escalating tensions in order to reach a peaceful settlement of this conflict, and that both parties will sit together on the negotiation table in order to reach such a peaceful settlement. We also hope that international efforts will be intensified on both the political and diplomatic levels to assist the parties to end this crisis, and in order to avoid the dire consequences that have risen and could arise out of this conflict. And we would like to reiterate that all parties, and I insist all parties, should respect the international humanitarian law, human rights, and the international refuge law without any discrimination. To conclude, Jordan would like to remind of the necessity of respecting the international law provisions and the UN Charter, whereas force should not be used against other countries and peoples, and should not be used against the right to self-determination, and that a single standard should be implemented regardless of the region concerned and without any discrimination in implementing international criteria and standards. And we hope that this would lead to an effective dialogue inside the organization in order to implement this approach and to assess the current approach and to reach our common goal. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the distinguished representative of Jordan. We have heard the last speaker in explanations of vote after the vote. We will now hear statements after the adoption of the resolution. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, dear colleagues, last week the UN Security Council was prevented to act against Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military aggression on Ukraine because of one isolated vote, that of the Russian Federation. Immediately after that, we initiated work to ensure that this body, where the countries of the world can all speak up, lives up to its responsibility. Over the past few days, the European Union has worked hand in hand with Ukraine and countries from all parts of the world to prepare the resolution just adopted. We thank all countries that have supported it. The decision is clear. The world has spoken. The Russian government must immediately stop the aggression, withdraw its troops, and abide by the rules of the UN Charter that applies to all equally. Over the past days, the brutality of Russia's invasion, with the complicity of Belarus, has reached unimaginable levels, with indiscriminate attacks against Ukrainian cities causing death and destruction among civilians in complete disregard of international law. Distinguished colleagues and friends, this is not just about Ukraine. This is not just about Europe. This is about defending an international order based on rules we have all signed up to, the sovereign equality of all states, large and small. This is about whether we choose tanks and missiles or dialogue and diplomacy. Today's historic vote clearly shows Russia's isolation from the rest of the international community. By voting overwhelmingly in favor of the resolution, we have chosen to defend peace where Russia has chosen brutal aggression. We have chosen to defend this organization and its charter where Russia has violated the fundamentals of both. Russia stands increasingly alone. The European Union and the world stand with the Ukrainian people. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 8 Nordic Baltic countries, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. Mr. President, from all corners of the world we have come together to send a resounding yes to uphold international law and the UN Charter, a resounding yes to the principle of the sovereign equality of all UN member states, a resounding yes to the need to respect the territorial integrity, sovereignty and political independence of all UN member states, a resounding message to Ukraine and all Ukrainians. In the words of a colleague who spoke yesterday, you are not alone. We stand with you today, tomorrow, and until peace prevails and Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity are fully restored and respected. We have also sent a clear message to Russia and to Belarus. Stop the aggression now. Full stop. What you are doing is unacceptable. It is wrong. Your unprovoked aggression against Ukraine is a violation of the core principles that you signed up to when you laid the foundation of this very organization, of this community of nations. Your invasion of Ukraine deserves our strongest condemnation. You will be held accountable, and every legal avenue available must and will be used to hold the aggressor to account. You must stop the war immediately. You must return your troops to Russia. You must return to the path of peace, of genuine dialogue. It is not too late to stop. It is not too late to reverse the course. It is not too late for you to return to this community where we believe, with all our faults and imperfections, in the principle of the sovereign equality of all. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned by the grave unfolding humanitarian crisis. We demand that all parties fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law, protect civilians and critical civilian infrastructure, and ensure the safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access and passage. Humanitarian and medical personnel, as well as hospitals and other medical facilities, must be protected. Mr. President, thousands of civilians have been killed, more have been injured, and close to 1 million innocent civilians have been forced to flee across borders. Even more have been internally displaced inside Ukraine. They are in need of help and assistance, without delay, without hindrance and preconditions. And we take this opportunity to salute and express our deepest respect, appreciation and admiration for the generous assistance and protection that Ukraine's neighbors have shown to all those fleeing the conflict, men, women and children from all corners of the world. Once again, we conclude by echoing the words of a peaceful protester who had written on her sign, "If Russia stops fighting, there will be no more war. If Ukrainians stop fighting, there will be no more Ukraine." I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Denmark. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank you for convening this historic emergency special session of the General Assembly, a session that was called because the Security Council failed once again to fulfill its primary responsibility. A session that was convened due to the unjustified, illegal, and illegitimate act of aggression against a founding member of the United Nations by a permanent member of the very organ entrusted by the entire membership with preserving peace and security. A session that was held as a result of the use of veto power by the very member that's perpetrating the aggression. Mr. President, we are obliged to reiterate Russia's ongoing military offensive against Ukraine blatantly violates the fundamental rules of international law and the principles on which this august organization was founded. Rules and principles that aim to prevent wars and protect mankind from disastrous consequences. Consequences that we are unfortunately witnessing in and around Ukraine due to Russia's attacks. The international community could not have been as spectators to such an act of aggression. I am proud that as of today, it is not. With today's resolution, the United Nations emphasizes loud and clear that it stands against egregious violations of the independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political unity of fellow member states. The membership is committed to preserving the letter and spirit of the fundamental constitutional document of our organization, the Charter. By adopting this resolution, the most democratic institution of the multilateral system denounces in the strongest possible terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine. We applaud the member states who contributed to the collective endeavor that culminated in today's outcome. You have stood firm in upholding full respect for the UN Charter and preserving the rules-based international order. We hope and trust that the calls and demands in this historic resolution will not fall on deaf ears. This body must follow through with its decision. Once again, we call on Russia to hear the demands of the global community and heed its own people's pleas to stop its military operations, withdraw all its forces from Ukraine, reverse its decision regarding the areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine and its annexation of Crimea, and return to diplomacy and dialogue without delay. We also reiterate our call for an immediate humanitarian pause. The peoples of the world hold their breath and wait with hope to see the march to the precipice halt. It is still not too late to go back to the negotiating table with serious engagement. Mr. President, as a neighbor and friend of both the Russian and the Ukrainian people, Turkey stands ready to facilitate the peaceful settlement of the conflict. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey. We still have 9 more countries member states who wish to speak. Therefore, we have heard the last speaker in statements after adoption. For this meeting, we shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon in this hall at 3 p.m. The meeting is adjourned.
Just a heads up that the meeting has adjourned, so the President of the General Assembly will be out soon. Yep.
very good afternoon. Resolution ES-11/1 passed today with the support of 141 member states. It reflects the international community's grave concerns about the ongoing situation in Ukraine and reiterates the call for an immediate ceasefire, unhindered access for humanitarian support, and return to dialogue and diplomacy. Specifically, the resolution demands a cessation in the use of force and the withdrawal of all military from Ukraine. It points to the principles set forth in the Charter of the United Nations and the Declaration on Friendly Relations. I join member states in expressing concern about reports of attacks on civilian facilities such as residences, schools, and hospitals, and of civilian casualties, including women, older persons, persons with disabilities, and children. I also share concerns about the deteriorating humanitarian situation in and around Ukraine, with an increasing number of internally displaced persons and refugees in need of humanitarian assistance. I thus welcome the $1.7 billion humanitarian appeal launched yesterday and call on the international community to support it. As requested by the member states in the resolution, I look forward to receiving in 30 days the report of the Emergency Relief Coordinator on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and on the humanitarian response. As President of the General Assembly, and in line with the resolution adopted today, the 11th Emergency Special Session will be temporarily adjourned this afternoon. I stand ready to resume the session upon the request of member states. I thank you.
Mr. President, one question.